Richardson was in fight.
You're listening to Diasporic music on Black Power 96. We apologize for the technical glitch. I think that is, I think we can blame that on the state. And I was introducing Dr. Gerald Horne, who currently holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And he has about many books, dozens of books. And one of his books is Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. And it's a great read. I suggest that everyone pick up that particular book and pick up anything you can on Mr. Robeson, and especially pick up his own book, Here I Stand. And Dr. Horne, how are you feeling today, sir?
Hey, I'm all good. How about you?
As Sam Cooke would say, wonderful. I'm good. I'm real good. Believe it or not, I'm good.
Right on.
And Melinda, did you want to begin the discussion?
Yeah, I mean, let's start out off. Let's go to Macron in China.
It was a very fascinating trip, insofar as Mr. Macron was escaping France, where his favorite restaurant in Paris had just been burned down in the context of demonstrations by those who were opposed to his attempt to tamper with the retirement age. Mr. Macron announced beforehand that he was going to China in part to try to save China from the clutches of the so-called evil empire in Moscow, which barely passes the giggle test. Obviously, when he flew into China with a plane load of businessmen, he was attempting to save the French economy by negotiating for contracts. And he apparently left with contracts, particularly for Airbus, the plane manufacturer, which is a chief competitor to the US-based Boeing. But he has been criticized in the US press because the US recognizes that he has broken with the Biden administration with regard to the new Cold War, targeting Beijing. And that suggests that this new Cold War may have tough sledding. It's also interesting to look at the fact that he was accompanied by the president of the European Commission, speaking of Ursula von der Leyen. That is the body that incorporates the 24 plus European nations that comprise the European Union. And before lifting off for China, Madame von der Leyen had made a very inflammatory speech targeting China. The essence of the speech was that just as Washington talks about decoupling from China, which I think is really rhetoric, that's more than a notion, given the fact that US corporations are deeply integrated into the Chinese economy, everything from Tesla to Apple to Starbucks to KFC to Microsoft. And it's hard to think that they're all going to have to take a haircut for this political objective, but we shall see. But in any case, Madame von der Leyen said that the EU should pursue de-risking from China, which, even if you're a semanticist, you may not necessarily see a material difference between decoupling and de-risking. Apparently, she sees a difference. The Chinese were displeased. It may be a joke, but my sources tell me that when she landed at the airport in China, there was no pomp and circumstance, unlike the greeting from Mr. Macron. And they have suggested that she even had to queue in the line that tourists go through to enter into China. I think that's an exaggeration. But if you look at the pictures of her, Macron, and President Xi, she is sort of standing off to the side. And Mr. Macron and President Xi are almost standing shoulder to shoulder. And even more in terms of the visuals of this trip, look at the three-person meeting between Macron and Madame von der Leyen and President Xi. there's this gigantic table with Mr. Xi Jinping at the center, and almost in another jurisdiction to the right and the left are Macron and von der Leyen, as if Mr. Xi has imbibed that saying from the United States, which is that it's best to sup with the devil with a long spoon. It reminded me of the meeting in February 2022 between President Putin and President Macron. You might recall that there was a 30-foot long table with Mr. Macron at one end and Mr. Putin at the other. And so I guess Mr. Putin set the stage. But despite the fact that Mr. Macron walked away with contracts, there was grumbling and rumbling about how the meetings went. Because Mr. Macron, like a typical imperialist, or I should say a typical European or Euro-American, although he's a European, he was seeking to dominate the conversations. He was seeking to lecture Mr. Xi Jinping, particularly about Russia. And Mr. Xi Jinping was saying, no dice, we're not going there. Because, I mean, think about it for a second. Basically, Macron is saying to Xi Jinping, we want you to turn your back on Moscow so that we can unite and come after China. Now, I can see that. Anybody can see that. So why should the Chinese go along with that kind of scheme? But in any case, it reflects the desperation of the North Atlantic countries, the hysteria of the North Atlantic countries. They painted themselves into a corner by this maniacal obsession with Moscow, which led to this arrangement with China in the first instance. And by the way, just as a footnote, I've been reading a number of dissertations lately. This is that time of year, doctoral dissertations from students, not only here, but at other universities. And what strikes me is that there is a line amongst the younger scholars, which is that China was the revolutionary power when it was denouncing Moscow, and that now China is not worthy of support because of whatever reason. In other words, when China was critical of the doctrine of peaceful coexistence between different social systems, that was the right on position. And now when China sees that peaceful coexistence between different social systems should be the order of the day, which does not necessarily, as you know, portend selling out the developing countries. I mean, it didn't mean that when Russia was doing, or Soviet Union was doing it. After all, they were back in Vietnam in armed struggle, supported Cuba against U.S. imperialism, supporting the Southern Africans. So I'm not sure where these younger folks are getting these ideas from. And I'm not even sure if they'll listen to me, because actually, there's no need for them to listen to me, because as I've told them all, as they say in the United States, there are people now who are living their best life after ignoring my advice. And so they may want to enter that charm circle.
Well, I was probably, when I was coming up, I know I did take that same position, but it was primarily because we saw race as the primary question. I shouldn't say the primary question. Race was the only, in the beginning, race was the only question. I mean, we hated to, I'm speaking for myself and some people, we disliked the Soviet Union more than we disliked the Ku Klux Klan. I mean, the anti-communism was in my neighborhood in many neighborhoods was strong. It was stronger than strong. You know that for a fact.
Oh, sure, absolutely. But in any case, we'll see what happens. I mean, back to the main thread, and the main thread being the fact that, as Mr. Xi said when he was exiting his meeting a few days ago with Mr. Putin, there are changes afoot in the world that haven't been seen in a century. I might argue that they haven't been seen in 5 centuries. You have a fundamental shift in the global correlation of forces. You have the rise of China, which will have monumental impact on the theory and practice of white supremacy. And it helps to undergird why Mr. Macron found it necessary to jet off to China in the midst of an internal crisis and beg for contracts with. And it helps to explain why Madame von der Leyen was treated so shabbily. So whatever the case, the dogs bark, but the caravan moves on.
And we're speaking to Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the author of many great books. And there's a great book on Paul Robeson, the artist as revolutionary. I wanted to ask you about this situation with the two Democrats, young Democrats, being expelled from the meeting the other day. They were the two Justins. One Justin, when I see the one Justin looks exactly, he looked like the identical twin of Owusu Sodoki, aka Howard Fuller, who led the African liberation struggle at one point, and now he's a Republican and a very conservative young man. And the other brother, I looked at him and I thought he sort of, I could see, he looked like First Nations and African and First Nations. But I found out that his mother, he's born in Oakland. He has one of his parents is Filipino and the other parent is African American. And could you talk about that whole situation? What was just took place the other day?
Well, you're referring to what's going on in the state of Tennessee. Tennessee being the home of the Ku Klux Klan. There was a statue to its founder, Nathan Bedford Forrest, in Memphis until quite recently. Memphis, Tennessee, also the home of a great number of jazz musicians, including the saxophonist Charles Lloyd, Jimmy Lunkford, et al. And what happened is that after the school shooting in Nashville, Tennessee, that led to the death of 3 kids and 3 adults, the good folk in Nashville stormed the Capitol demanding that there be gun control legislation. The right wing takes the position, I kid you not, that they don't want gun control legislation because they think the people should be armed in case they have to shoot out of power a government they don't like. And so the two Justins grabbed the bullhorn and started speaking on behalf of gun control. They were joined by a Euro-American legislator as well, but the two Justins were expelled. The Euro-American was not. I'll leave it to you to figure out how that happened. But it also ties into the peculiar politics of Nashville, because the two main cities, as you know, are Memphis and Nashville, where the capital is located. Memphis is not far distant from Mississippi and Arkansas, and bears the egregious white supremacy of those latter two states, as exemplified by the former statue to Nathan Bedford Forrest, the leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Nashville, on the other hand, is more akin to Austin, Texas, or Madison, Wisconsin, in the sense that it is also the home of a leading university, Vanderbilt University, just like Madison is the home of University of Wisconsin. Austin is the home of the University of Texas. That helps to bring liberalizing influences there. During the U.S. Civil War, there was a lot of anti-slavery sentiment in Nashville, unlike Memphis, for example. So the state has a bipolar division between these two major cities, and that's being played out right now. I expect the two Justins to return to their seats. However, I don't expect any gun control legislation out of Nashville anytime soon.
Let me say that Nashville is also the birthplace of Dick Griffey, who was the head of Solar Records, and Leon Thomas, and they actually had a band together. Dick Griffey is a drummer, and Leon Thomas, as you know, the great singer. The creator has a master plan, and you know, Leon Thomas did a lot of work for Pharoah Sanders, right?
That's right. I always thought Leon Thomas was from East St. Louis.
He might have been from East St. Louis, but I know he and Dick Griffey played in a band together in Nashville. Now they could have been going to school at that time together. So let me clarify that they played in a band together in Nashville. Now, whether or not Leon Thomas from East St. Louis, he might be. I'm not saying where. I don't know where he's from. I know that he and Griffey played together in a band.
Born in East St. Louis in 1937, died in the Bronx in 1999.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
He studied music at Tennessee State University, another leading university in Nashville, along with Fisk University, where W.E.B. Du Bois matriculated some decades ago. Tennessee State University, of course, historically black college, also produced the great shooting guard from the New York Knicks, speaking of Dick Barnett, if I'm not mistaken.
He went on Detroit, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so it's a city that's happening, and of course, it's the home of country music as well.
Boy, don't let me start talking about country music. But anyway, we need to stick to the script. Any more questions, Melinda? Is Melinda on mute? Or she?
I was on mute. So let's go to the Chief Trump indictment.
Well, yes. Mr. Trump has been indicted for transgressions involving a hush money to a person, Stormy Daniels, described as a adult film actress, a film star of some sort. And he's facing trial. The trial might unfold during the presidential campaign. Right now, I think there's a good chance that the 45th U.S. president will become the 47th U.S. president, despite the fact that he's also facing possible indictment in the state of Georgia. We're trying to rig the election there in 2020. He's facing federal charges in Washington, D.C. because of purloining documents and not turning them back over to the National Archives, where his role in the January 6th insurrection. He's facing a civil trial involving an apparent rape of a woman, E. Jean Carroll, I believe her name is. But he has a base. And that's another thing, too, about some of these dissertations that I'm reading. Nobody has this is not just these students, but it's in the United States and the left generally. Nobody has a credible explanation as to why Mr. Trump is so popular amongst Euro-Americans across class lines, except that, if the Democrats would just endorse the Green New Deal, then they could beat Mr. Trump. Obviously, that ignores a lot of history. I mean, it ignores class collaboration, which undergirded settler colonialism. It undergirds the ideological concessions that are made to the right wing. For example, calling the revolt against British rule in 1776 that led to the formation of the United States is a great leap forward, even though it was not for the Africans, even though it was not for the indigenous or the First Nations, as you would have it. And so there's a kind of left-wing white nationalism that's quite prominent in this country. And the way things stand now, if we're not careful, we'll have plenty of time in the concentration camps to debate these issues.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We're running out of time. You wanted to ask us a hockey question, right? What exactly would you like us to deal with?
Well, I know that the Boston Bruins are doing quite well now. And I heard a report from a fan of the Montreal Canadiens who was talking about that team's and their fan base hatred for the Boston Bruins. And it occurred to me that there might be anti-Yankee antipathy expressed during hockey games, either by the fans, the announcers, whatever. I mean, just like in baseball games, you oftentimes, when they play "O Canada," the Canadian national anthem, south of the border, these U.S. fans, they start to boo. I'm not sure why they should have hostility towards Canada. So I'm wondering if that sentiment is reciprocated in Canada, particularly in hockey games.
Hockey games, I haven't been to too many hockey games, but the Canadians get down and get funky and get loose at hockey games. There's a lot of rumblings. I know a lot of Canadians, especially Canadians, African Canadians that were born here, pride themselves on liking hockey because, they get a chance to demonstrate their, pugilistic talent? A lot of people like hockey because there's a lot of fighting in it. Now, if you ever see one of the biggest hockey players in the world, maybe it was Sidney Crosby. Now he doesn't even have. He has false teeth in the front. He has his teeth knocked out, and many hockey players don't have teeth. And I know what's the name? Ovechkin is one of the top hockey players of all time, and he gets a lot of heat because he is very pro Putin. When I say very pro Putin, he talks about Putin like Mr. Putin, Vladimir Putin can walk on water. That's his man, and a lot of people hate him for that.
What about anti-Yankee sentiment?
I've never heard of an audience booing like the American anthem. If that's, you know what I mean? Like I didn't even know that they were doing that at hockey games in the States. Yeah, I've never heard of that, so I don't think it's the same sentiment at all.
Oh, okay. Fair enough.
Did you?
Well, I don't know. We have lots to talk about, but did we want to talk about the Taiwan leader in the U.S. and the banking crisis?
Well, yeah. Let's circle back to China because the leader of Taiwan, speaking of President Tsai Ing-wen, she transited the United States on her way to Belize and Guatemala, two of the 13 nations that still recognize Taiwan as being the legitimate government of all of China. And she also met in New York with Congressman Gregory Meeks, the leading spokesperson for the Congressional Black Caucus on Foreign Affairs. He visited Taiwan, you may recall, in August of last year with then Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And so once again, the Black American leadership is signing on to these dangerous escapades. And then President Tsai Ing-wen met with the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, in Los Angeles. And China has retaliated by conducting military drills as we speak. The event to watch are the January 24 elections, because as President Tsai Ing-wen was in the United States, the leader of the opposition had spent 12 days in China. And it's a good possibility that the opposition will prevail in these January elections, in which case all of the military equipment that the United States has dumped on Taiwan maybe even be turned over to China. And it will also give China a kind of jurisdiction over the big prize in Taiwan, which is TSMC, which is the major global manufacturer of computer chips, which are used from everything from the smartphones to cars. And right now, TSMC is investing billions in the United States, believe it or not, particularly in Arizona. in case the election leads to a change in regime. But the problem with the United States and China can be encapsulated in what I'm about to say. If you look at major universities, such as the University of California at Berkeley, right now, by several orders of magnitude, that university is educating more students from the People's Republic of China, not Chinese Americans, more students from the People's Republic of China in virtually every field you can think of, more students than Black Americans. So how does that figure? I mean, I thought they were in a new Cold War. So why are they educating the flower? Of course, it speaks to the point that these people are so blindly racist towards Black Americans, which has a lot to do with the fact that we were formerly property. The property was confiscated in 1865 without compensation. You want to infuriate a capitalist, confiscate their property without compensation. And so they're still blindly striking out at us, up to and including helping to educate the flower of youth of China, which is supposedly, we are told, the enemy du jour.
I think we're running out of time, but I have one question. This is the most burning question of all. What do you think about Abena's visit to Ghana?
You mean Kamala Harris?
Yeah, you caught it. Yeah, yeah. The president of Ghana gave Kamala Harris the name Abena. I think that's a girl born on Tuesday, I believe.
Oh yeah. Well, the takeaway from that journey is that virtually every airport she landed at during this journey, Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, every airport was either partially or wholly designed and or funded by Chinese interests. And so when you come to a country like that, spouting an anti-China line, stay away from China, and yet China is building infrastructure that people know about, well, of course, you expect the Africans to listen politely and respond diplomatically, because just like China helps to subsidize infrastructure, the United States helps to subsidize healthcare, because they don't want AIDS and Ebola and COVID to spread from Africa to the United States. That's one of the reasons they do it. And so I think that the anti-China line basically fell on deaf ears. But having said that, watch Zambia. Zambia is getting a lot of attention from the United States right now. I think it's because it borders Zimbabwe. The United States, as you know, has hostile relations with Zimbabwe because of the expropriation of the fruits of settler colonialism, meaning the land seizures by European settlers decades ago. And Zimbabwe is tightening relations with China. Zimbabwe has a mother lode of lithium, which is essential to the green economy. That's one of the reasons why the European Union nations would like to improve relations with Zimbabwe. And also, the United States is not fond of South Africa right now because of South Africa's membership in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa's military maneuvers with the Chinese and Russian militaries off the coast of South Africa just some weeks ago. And so they apparently expect Zambia to be used as a cudgel against Zimbabwe and South Africa. I would warn Lusaka that that's a fool's errand, that they do not want to pursue that path. And I should also mention Zambia's proximity to Congo. Now, Congo, I think it's fair to say, is fairly in the imperialist camp. Dan Gertner, who is this Israeli billionaire who controls a lot of the resources of Congo, President Tshisekedi has been lobbying Washington not to crack down on him, believe it or not. But apparently, perhaps the imperialists want to cuddle up to Zambia in case Kinshasa decides to turn its back and try to cut deals with the Russians and the Chinese. It's a very complicated plot, and once again, we should keep our eyes peeled.
Let me say the last thing that I think the brother's name was Chet Swayo. He's an African American who moved to Zambia. He was a Panther.
Oh yeah.
It was either his birthday or or the anniversary of his passing. Zambia had a pretty good relationship. I mean, they were the frontline state, but Kenneth Kaunda, wouldn't you say he did quite a bit for Africans in terms of the frontline states and like helping people, sort of like was a sanctuary for African people who are on the left? Or am I correct in saying that?
Well, yes. In my forthcoming book on Washington, D.C., Revolting Capital, Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000, it'll be out in a few days. I talk about W. Alpheus Hunton, who had deep roots in Canada, by the way. His ancestors met with John Brown in Ontario right before the raid on Harpers Ferry, Virginia in 1859. W. Alpheus Hunton, a comrade of W.E.B. Du Bois, taught at Howard University, moved to Zambia, where he died some decades ago. Kenneth Kaunda, who was known for his flowing tears, cried and wept at his grave when Mr. Alpheus Hunton was laid 6 feet under. Of course, he's one of a number of Black Americans buried in Africa, including W.E.B. Du Bois himself, buried in Ghana. And the Black Panther you mentioned, he figures in my book on Southern Africa, White Supremacy Confronted, because there was a monumental delegation of Panthers to Congo, Brazzaville, not Congo, Kinshasa, Congo, Brazzaville, when it was the People's Republic of the Congo. It was a historic journey, and I'm going to write about it more in the next book I write, Armed Struggle, ? Panthers, Communists, and Black Nationalism in Southern California through the 1960s.
Serge Ibaka is from Congo, Brazzaville. The great basketball. Yeah. Serge. And Walter Rodney quotes Alpheus Hunton in How Europe Underdeveloped. One of his books where he bigs up and pays tribute to Hunton big time. He talks about him. His wife was a great was his comrade as well. She was just as prominent as he was. What am I correct in saying that?
Yes, and both figure in my book. So make a note to order that book, Revolting Capital, and I'm sure you can understand the triple meaning of that title.
And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Horne, and I would like to thank Lisa Watson for her technical brilliance, and thank Belinda Francis for helping put this show together. And we will see everyone in the whirlwind. Take care.
Good luck.